Every empire has its arteries, the lifelines that connect its heart to the rest of the world. For Russia, those arteries were not only pipelines and highways, but also the steel veins of its railways stretching across Eurasia. For years, Moscow relied on a land bridge through Ukraine to reach China and the broader Asian markets, a rail corridor that carried goods, fuel, raw materials, and even military equipment. It was not just a trade route. It was a symbol of Russia's ability to balance between Europe and Asia, to claim its role as the bridge of continents. But today, that bridge is gone. Ukraine has shut down the main railway crossings that once allowed Russian trains to roll toward China and beyond. Hundreds of trains are stranded, cargo stuck in limbo, crews waiting with no answers, goods worth billions sitting idle in yards and border checkpoints. For Moscow, the loss is devastating. For China, it is a logistical nightmare, and for the world, it is the latest reminder that geography and war can strangle globalization in an instant. The background: Russia's Eurasian corridor. For decades, Russia touted its geography as destiny. Stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific, it promoted itself as the natural land bridge between Europe and Asia. The Siberian Railway was the backbone of this vision, but equally critical were the southern corridors, the routes through Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus that linked Russia not just to Europe, but to China. These corridors became essential in the early 2000s when China's Belt and Road Initiative took shape. Beijing wanted fast, reliable land routes to Europe, and Moscow positioned itself as the indispensable partner. Containers of electronics, textiles, and manufactured goods moved westward from China through Russian and Ukrainian rails, while oil, gas, coal, and metals moved eastward. Ukraine's crossings were the hinge, the point where Russia's system linked into China's. Without them, the flow could not continue. Even after Crimea's annexation in 2014, the corridors remained active, albeit tense. Ukraine knew the leverage it had, but also profited from the transit. But after years of conflict, sanctions, and escalating war, Kyiv made its decision. The crossings would be shut down. And with that decision, Moscow's China land bridge collapsed. Ukraine's move a strategic shutdown. Kyiv did not make the move lightly. Closing the crossings meant giving up millions in transit revenue. But it also meant striking a blow at Moscow's economic arteries. Ukrainian officials justified the move as both a security measure and an act of strategic denial. Too often, they argued, Russia used the corridor not just for trade but for covert shipments of military technology, dual-use equipment, and supplies that fueled its war machine. By sealing the crossings, Ukraine cut off Moscow's access to one of the last efficient overland routes to China. Alternative routes existed, but they were longer, more expensive, and less secure. Overnight, Russia's logistical calculations were thrown into chaos. Hundreds of trains stranded. The immediate consequence was chaos on the rails. Hundreds of trains. Freight carriers loaded with coal, oil, machinery, grain, and consumer goods ground to a halt. Some sat on sidings deep inside Russian territory, unable to proceed. Others piled up at Ukrainian checkpoints, engines idling, crews confused. Cargo owners sent desperate messages asking when deliveries would resume. Logistics companies scrambled to reroute through Kazakhstan, Mongolia, or even Arctic shipping lanes. Satellite images showed long lines of freight cars stretching for kilometers. Social media lit up with videos of stranded conductors cooking meals beside their locomotives, waiting for news. Every day those trains sit idle. Millions are lost. Perishable goods spoil. Contracts are broken. Insurance rates skyrocket. What was once a seamless corridor has become a dead end. The economic fallout: Moscow feels the pain. For Moscow, the impact is brutal. Already isolated from Europe by sanctions and closed borders, Russia turned increasingly to China as its economic lifeline. Chinese demand for oil, gas, and raw materials became Russia's salvation. In return, Russia imported Chinese electronics, machinery, and consumer goods. The land bridge through Ukraine made that trade fast and cost-effective. Now, with the crossing shut, Russia is forced to use longer detours through Kazakhstan and Mongolia. These routes add thousands of kilometers, strain infrastructure, and face their own bottlenecks. Costs soar, delivery times double, and reliability plunges. For a country already struggling under sanctions, the blow is severe. Russian exporters of coal and oil see contracts threatened. Grain shipments stall. Factories waiting on Chinese machinery report delays. For Moscow's planners, the shutdown is a nightmare scenario. China remains a partner, but the bridge connecting them has vanished. China's dilemma and unwanted disruption. For Beijing, Ukraine's move is equally problematic. China has invested heavily in land-based trade routes as part of its Belt and Road vision. Rail transport from China to Europe via Russia and Ukraine was one of the flagship routes, cutting shipping times in half compared to sea transport. Now, that corridor is broken. Hundreds of containers bound for Europe are stuck. Supply chains are scrambled. Chinese companies complain about costs and delays. For Beijing, the disruption highlights a vulnerability. Its land routes depend on political stability across Eurasia, something increasingly rare. While China will push to reroute trade through Kazakhstan and Turkey, the symbolic loss of the Ukraine corridor is immense. It shows that Beijing cannot count on Moscow to guarantee stability, and it forces Chinese planners to rethink their Eurasian strategy. The human impact workers and communities. Beyond the grand strategies, there are human stories of disruption. Railway workers in Russia and Ukraine suddenly find themselves without jobs. Communities along the corridor, once bustling with cargo traffic, fall silent. Small businesses that served rail crews collapse. In Ukraine, some welcome the shutdown as a blow to Russia, but others mourn the lost income. In Russia, frustration mounts as people see the costs trickle down, higher prices for imported goods, shortages of key items, and uncertainty about future employment. For the crews stranded on trains, life becomes surreal. They wait for days or weeks with no movement, caught between borders, unsure whether their cargo will ever reach its destination. In online forums, they share photos of endless train lines, idle locomotives, and meals cooked over makeshift stoves. Their plight becomes a symbol of the larger geopolitical stalemate, Moscow's strategic dilemma. The loss of the Ukraine corridor puts Moscow in a strategic bind. Its dream of being the indispensable bridge between Europe and Asia has crumbled. With Europe largely closed and now the China land bridge severed, Russia is left looking east, but relying entirely on China is dangerous. Beijing gains leverage, dictating prices and terms. Moscow, once the senior partner, becomes the junior at the same time. Alternative routes are limited. The Trans-Siberian can only handle so much traffic. Routes through Central Asia face bottlenecks. Maritime transport is slower and vulnerable to sanctions. For Moscow, every option is worse than the corridor it lost. The shutdown also has military implications. Railways are the backbone of Russian logistics. The inability to move supplies efficiently across borders complicates Moscow's strategic calculations. It makes projecting power more difficult. It forces Russia to devote resources to protecting fragile detours, and it deepens the sense of isolation. Ukraine's strategic victory. For Kyiv, the closure is a strategic victory. By shutting the corridor, Ukraine hits Moscow where it hurts most, the economy. It disrupts Russia's partnership with China. It undermines Moscow's claim to be Eurasia's land bridge, and it demonstrates Ukraine's power to shape global logistics. The move also strengthens Kyiv's standing with its Western allies. By disrupting Russia's trade, Ukraine contributes directly to the economic pressure campaign, and by showing it can influence Chinese supply chains, Kyiv proves its global relevance. The global impact supply chains rerouted. The closure has ripple effects beyond Russia and China. European companies that relied on fast rail transport from China now face delays. Global supply chains, already strained by the pandemic and geopolitical tensions, are disrupted again. Shipping firms scramble to adjust. Prices for certain goods rise. Insurance markets react nervously. The disruption also accelerates broader trends. Europe invests more heavily in alternative routes through Turkey, the Caucasus, and the Mediterranean. China increases its focus on maritime routes, even as it laments the delays. And the dream of a seamless Eurasian land bridge, once so central to both Russia's and China, ambitions fades into uncertainty. The symbolism, a broken bridge, more than economics, the closure is symbolic. For centuries, Russia portrayed itself as the bridge between East and West. Its geography was its destiny, its justification for empire. But now, that identity is shattered. The bridge to Europe is closed. The bridge to China is broken. Moscow, once the crossroads of continents, finds itself isolated. For the world, the image of hundreds of stranded trains is more than a logistical failure. It is a metaphor for Russia's predicament, a nation stuck between past glory and present isolation, unable to move forward. Future scenarios: where do we go from here? Several futures are possible. In the first, Russia and China invest heavily in alternative routes through Kazakhstan and Mongolia, creating a new corridor that bypasses Ukraine. This would take years and billions of dollars, but it would restore some connectivity in the second. Maritime routes take precedence. China relies more on shipping through the Indian Ocean and Suez Canal, while Russia fades from Eurasian trade networks. In the third, political change reopens the corridor. If the war ends and Ukraine negotiates new terms, some crossings could resume under strict conditions. But trust is broken, and rebuilding will not be easy. In all scenarios, one truth remains: the era of Moscow as Eurasia's land bridge is over. The closure marks a turning point in the continent's history. Conclusion: the end of a dream. History is often remembered through great speeches, decisive battles, and moments of triumph. But in reality, some of the most consequential shifts happen quietly, not with explosions, but with silence. Not with armies advancing, but with trains that stop moving and borders that suddenly close. The shutdown of Ukraine's crossings marks one of those turning points. It may not be dramatic in sound, but its echoes will be felt for decades. For Moscow, the dream of being the indispensable bridge between East and West has collapsed. For years, Russian leaders told themselves and the world that their geography was their greatest weapon. They believed that by controlling the flow of goods, energy, and resources between Europe and Asia, they could not only profit but also wield influence no one else could match. That vision has been shattered. With Ukraine's crossing sealed, the steel arteries of Moscow's Eurasian ambitions have been cut. The humiliation is not just symbolic, it is painfully practical. Trains that once carried containers of electronics, automobiles, and raw materials across the vast expanse of Eurasia now sit stranded. Crews are left waiting, unsure if their cargo will ever reach its destination. Every hour those trains remain idle is money lost, contracts broken, and trust eroded. For a country that once prided itself on being the keeper of a continental bridge, the stillness of the tracks is a devastating blow. For Beijing, the shutdown is a wake-up call. China had invested heavily in the idea of a new Silk Road, with rail links through Russia and Ukraine forming a central piece of its Belt and Road Initiative. Those plans now look fragile, exposed to geopolitical storms that no amount of infrastructure spending can easily weather. For Chinese strategists, the lesson is clear. Over-reliance on routes through politically unstable or hostile regions is a gamble that can end in paralysis. Diversification through Central Asia, the Middle East, and maritime routes will no longer be optional, it will be necessary. For the rest of the world, the closure is a reminder that globalization, often taken for granted, is built on fragile foundations. Every ship at sea, every truck on the highway, every train on the rails represents an invisible chain connecting billions of people. When even one link breaks, the effects ripple outward in unexpected ways. A missing shipment of machine parts in Europe can halt a factory line. A delay in grain deliveries can raise bread prices in Africa. The world may feel vast, but the closure of a single corridor proves how small and interdependent it truly is. And so, the end of Moscow's dream becomes more than just a Russian tragedy. It is a global cautionary tale. The bridges we build between nations can be powerful engines of prosperity, but they are not indestructible. They can be closed, sabotaged, or abandoned overnight. And history, once again, is being written not on the battlefield, but on the rails of Eurasia, where silence speaks louder than any victory parade.